So this is the same demo that we've used in previous modules. So if you remember, we have a main class here. So we have com.knowledgespike.main, and main uses a data access library and a data service library. On the service, it calls write. The service calls write on the data access code, and the data access code writes to the file system. And we have a policy file here which grants write permission to each of these code bases. So if I run this code from the command line using that policy and security manager, it all works fine. But suppose that our service jar doesn't have permission, but we'd still like to be able to write to the file system, because by writing to the file system, that's, let's say, our audit message. So I edit the policy file and I save it. If I go back to my command prompt and run the code again, it fails. And we know it fails, as we're doing a full stack walk to check all the permissions. So what we'd like to do here is inside the data access code is prevent that stack walk. We want this code to be privileged. We want this code to be able to write to the file system even if other things on the stack frame are not able to. So let me remove this code. So the way we make this thing privileged is by using accesscontroller.doPrivileged. And we know doPrivileged takes a privileged action type with a run method. And as we're using Java 8 here, we can use the new Lambda syntax to execute this code. So for the Lambda syntax, we're going to say something goes to some method, and the thing that's being passed in here is a privileged action. So we need to add the code in for this method. So the code for this is simply the writer code that we saw previously. So what's going to happen here is that when we call doPrivileged, this method will execute. This is the run method. The run method will execute, and then inside this run method, because we're inside a doPrivileged block, we prevent the stack walk. So we don't check what's calling us to see if what's calling us has permission. As long as we have permission, then we are fine. We can execute this code. This is going to throw some exceptions, so we put the appropriate catch clauses in, and we also need to return a value from this. This thing returns an object by default, so we just return null here to shut the compiler up. So if I build this code and then go back to the command prompt and run this code again, this code should now succeed as the data access jar file is privileged, and indeed it does. If I go back to my policy file and remove permissions from the data access jar file, and then go back to the command prompt and run the code again, it will fail. So even though it's privileged, it still needs permission to be able to do this. So we see here that even though the data access jar file can try and claim a privilege, once it's claimed that privilege, anything it tries to do will still be subject to security checks. So the fact that it can claim the privilege doesn't mean it can do anything. It's still then subject to the normal security checks. And we still have to give it permission to write to this file, otherwise the code will fail.